hello slimy fertilers, and a slightly different kind of video here for you today. This is just something I found kind of semi-interesting, and I just felt sort of compelled to speak on it for some reason, I don't know why. But it all started the other day when I saw this particular news piece pop up on my feed from the BBC News, and it states about the Australian, basically, refugee detention centre on Manus Island. And as you can see from the little thumbnail that they use there, why are you exploiting us, and hashtag Manus Island and stuff like that. And I thought, well, what the hell's this? So I clicked on it, and as the video shows, which I'll play in full later, and we'll go through and just speak about it. These are asylum seekers who are, on the face of it, they're being held prisoner in what appears to be horrible conditions. However, as the video goes on, you realise that these conditions are self-imposed, and it just seems strange to me that the Australian government would, do this to people or let this happen to people. So I decided to look into this a little more, because I was quite intrigued how a country like Australia would, do things like this to people, and it just seems a little bit horrible. But when you go back and have a look at how all this started, it's a kind of an interesting tale of modern times. So let's go back to the past, and let's get this sorted out from the beginning. Okay, now so we've crossed through the fourth dimension and have travelled back in time to 2001, August 2001 to be exact, and I'm just glad to say that I am not suffering any ill effects from temporal displacement or anything like that. Oh, fucking hell. Anyways, so the story begins in August 2001, when the Norwegian freighter vessel MV Tampa responded to a distress signal sent out by a fishing boat, an Indonesian fishing boat, which gave its name as the Palapa 1. It was identified as being a 20-metre wooden boat, and it was in distress just in international waters just short of Christmas Island, which was an Australian, basically an Australian overseas territory, or still is actually. But the Tampa changed course and went to render assistance. At the same time, the Australian government informed the Indonesian authorities in Jakarta that there was a vessel there, and if the Tampa took on, if the Tampa took people on board, then the closest port that could, successfully receive the Tampa, it had facilities for that ship to dock there and offload. The closest area was a port called Merak, which was in Indonesia. When the Tampa got to the Palapa, though, what they found was that the small 20-metre wooden boat, which was sinking, actually had about 440 people on it. This was full of refugees that were fleeing from the war in Afghanistan. The vast majority of the people that were there were of the Hazara ethnicity, and including mostly men, but including women and children. The exact figures were 26 women and 43 children, along with 369 men. The Tampa, with its limited facilities, realised that obviously they couldn't just leave them on the ship, because it was the only place it was going was Davy Jones's locker. So they took all the people off the boat and let them onto their vessel. And by this time, no other assistance had arrived. With limited facilities available on the ship, on the Tampa, which was only really meant to carry about 30 crew, because it was a cargo freighter. Not meant to have a really big crew or anything. It was just it's not like a warship or anything like that. They didn't really know what to do, and the captain of the vessel was a guy called Captain Arne Rinnan, who was a Norwegian national and has been a captain of a ship for about 23 years. He realised that Merak was the closest place that could receive them, but Christmas Island was closer. It was about, I don't know, about 3-4 hours sailing time away, whereas Merak was about 12 hours away. And given that the vast majority, well, a lot of the people that they'd taken off the Palapa were extremely ill, malnourished, and suffering from various ailments like dysentery and everything like that, he knew that he probably wasn't going to be able to get to Merak before some serious shit started going down, because the limited medical facilities out on that vessel. They had a doctor, but not really an experienced one. He was more, but according to Captain Rinnan, he was approached by a group of men from the from the people taken on board, and was basically told that he was to set course for Australia immediately. The people there didn't have anything to lose, and he was basically threatened. So he set course for Australia. Basically, he set course for the Christmas Islands because they were the closest place to get to. And that's where things started turning, where basically the shit hit the fan, and it became known as what was known as the Tampa incident. The ship, the ship approached Christmas Island and requested permission to offload the passengers there. But the Australian government refused. There wasn't facilities available to deal with the number of people there, and the facilities for the ship to actually successfully dock at Christmas Island were not available. A ship that size is fairly big, and it needs a big dock in order to be able to stop and weigh anchor and then start offloading people. So they were refused permission to enter, the Australian waters and to enter the Australian port. But unfortunately, the number of people on board that were ill kind of caused a lot of concern to Captain Rinnan, and this, as well as he alleges he was threatened by the people on board, caused him to declare a state of emergency, which he then said allowed him to enter Australian waters without permission. Eventually, the ship ended up dropping anchor about 4 miles from Christmas Island. The Australian government's response to this was, obviously they weren't very pleased, because they told him not to come anywhere near and to go to Indonesia. At least then they'd be able to dock properly and facilities would be made available for them. So having this ship turn up 4 miles off Christmas Island, wasn't really a good thing, and to this day the legitimacy of Captain Rinnan's decision is disputed. But the Australian government's response to this was to fly out Australian troops from the Australian SAS regiment. They boarded the ship and found that majority of people there were ill in some fashion, dehydrated, malnourishment, they weren't particularly happy, exhaustion, things like dysentery, scabies, head lice, gastroenteritis, all kind of stuff like that you'd associate with living in fairly poor conditions. There were 4 pregnant women amongst the people on board as well. The army doctors that accompanied them, or were part of the commando team that boarded the ship, got into disputes with the captain and the ship's medical officer, who the ship's medical officer wasn't particularly an experienced doctor, and the SAS doctors were pretty much wanting to take all of his medical supplies and do what they wanted with them, whereas he thought, because he was the ship's medical officer, he knew best, and he should be allowed to do what they want. The water on board the ship was also a point of contention as well, because the ship only had limited supplies of water intended for the crew of the Tampa, which was about 30 people, because this isn't a warship we're talking about, it's a cargo freighter. There's not really meant to be that many people on a cargo freighter. So they had to turn off the ship's water, because people that had been rescued, the army doctors said that they all needed to be washed, basically to get rid of the filth that was causing disease and diarrhea as well. People were getting diarrhea because they were filthy. So obviously this caused a bit of tension between the Australian military and the Norwegian crew. Now what happened was the Australian troops received instructions to tell Captain Rinnan to take the ship back out into international waters, which then would mean that certain things could happen and they could get things sorted out. Fortunately, Captain William refused to do this because he said he was more concerned about the people on board and he wanted them off his ship. That's fairly obvious by now when you read into the full story, but he wanted them off his ship. And he was dropping them on Christmas Island, whether the Australians liked it or not. The shipping company that Captain William worked for also backed him up on this, and the Norwegian government stepped in to state that if the Australians tried to use force, they basically advised them not to use force to try and get the Tampa back out into international waters. Meanwhile, the Australian government were speaking to the Indonesians to accept the asylum seekers, but now the Indonesian government was refusing because the vessel was now in Australian waters. So it's in Australian waters, therefore it's your problem. That's the stance they took. And Norway, whose ship the people were actually on, also refused to take any kind of responsibility for the people on board their ship. Because I don't know whether you know, but maritime law, it's basically, if you are on a Norwegian ship, no matter where you are, it's classed as Norway, it's Norwegian soil, if you know what I mean. You can have a Norwegian ship in Australian waters, but it's classed as Norwegian territory. The water, what that Norwegian territory, whether it should or shouldn't be in international waters, is again another thing for interpretation of maritime law, but generally speaking, any vessel that enters another country's, any vessel that enters another country's waters without permission from the country that owns that waters is in trouble. So the problem was that the Australian government had to get this sorted out in some fashion. And what they did was they had an emergency parliament session on the 29th of August and introduced an emergency bill called the Border Protection Bill 2001. So what this bill entitled the Australian government and the Australian authorities to do was essentially any vessel which entered Australian territory without any kind of authorisation to do so would be intercepted and returned to international waters using force if necessary. As we can see from this little map I've drawn here, it's a pretty bad drawing, but it's adequate for what I need to demonstrate here. The red area is classed as Australian waters, and I've put 4 little black dots on there representing Australian islands, which these are the Australian kind of overseas territories, including Christmas Island. Well, the four dots themselves actually represent Christmas Island and a couple of others, Ashmore Island and stuff like that. But basically, anyone who approached these islands was to be returned to international waters, like I said, by force if necessary. The idea behind this was to prevent illegal immigration into the country, or to prevent people from basically turning up in Australian territory and then claiming asylum, or something along those lines. And because at the time this incident came with quite unfortunate timing, because August 2001 was the run-up to the Australian elections, which was to take place in November of 2001. So this was a rather uncomfortable incident that the political class in Australia needed to get sorted quickly to the, basically to the satisfaction of both the government and the Australian people. So initially this was seen as fine, basically if you try and enter Australia illegally by boat, and this was happening a hell of a lot because there was a lot of people from the kind of Asia Pacific region who were just jumping into boats and making a run for Australian territory. And as it stood at the time, that if you managed to get to Australian territory, you could claim asylum there, which includes the mainland Australia, Tasmania, and the outlying islands that were all classed as part of Australia. So the bill itself was done there, and it was welcomed, and everybody thought it was great. But then, unfortunately, people started to find ways around it, and that included turning up on Australian islands. Just basically jumping in a boat, turning up on Australian islands and thinking they could get away with it. So the bill made the provision for for basically the following. They said that from now on, anybody who approaches the islands were no longer classified as being Australian territory, so therefore if you turned up at the islands and set foot on them, you could not automatically claim asylum in Australia. Again, this was seen as a good thing, so the islands were removed from the thing. So basically, anybody caught inside the red zone on the map would be, if they were caught, they will be escorted back to Australia, to international waters, and the people on the ships will be told, if you want to come to Australia, do it the proper way. Don't just turn up on a boat. Unfortunately, more and more ships kept coming, and they couldn't do this because obviously returning boats that were sinking to international waters was pretty shitty. So what they decided to do then was to set up what they called immigrant processing centres or refugee processing centres. The main two being located on Manus Island and Nauru. There were a couple of others as well that got set up, kind of temporary things, including one on Christmas Island itself. But the main two were Manus Island and Nauru. Manus Island is a small island off the coast of Papua New Guinea, which is a completely different country. So the Australians were basically exporting refugees to Papua New Guinea to an Australian naval base based on Manus Island. There was a compound built there for them. Nauru is actually a very small country all of its own. Again, it's another overseas sovereign nation, and the Australians were shipping people out there and putting them in camps. These are the main two that they are talking about. And for a while, this went on, and it got to the point where this so-called Pacific solution, which this whole kind of thing became known as a Pacific solution, was starting to kind of lose popularity because that many people were being sent to these main processing centres that people started to get pissed off, including people like Amnesty International and refugee rights groups and stuff like that, were saying that the policy itself was just being made up on the spot, which it was. And the facilities that were on Manus Island and Nauru were not sufficient for keeping people in a condition, in kind of an acceptable condition. The camps, the camps or the centres, they were basically prison camps or I say concentration camps. It's not that, an internment camp. There was limited electricity, limited food and water. The medical facilities weren't really that good, and the people that were sent there, the conditions that they were in these camps were criticised because they were nearly as bad as the conditions they would have had on the boat. So this eventually led in 2007, where just on the run up to the 2007 election in Australia, this led to this kind of policy being shut down. The Manus Island facility was closed in 2004, and the Nauru facility was closed in 2008. Although the Republic of Nauru were very, very concerned with the fact that because the Australian government wasn't paying to use their island as an internment camp anymore, that they would lose much needed aid. It was also pointed out at the time that by closing these camps and disregarding the Pacific Solution policy, it was suggested that this would suggest to people smugglers, human traffickers, that Australia was open for business again, that these people traffickers could start fetching people across and dropping them in Australia on a no-holds-barred basis. And obviously the Australian people weren't happy with this. So after the close down of the Manus Island and Nauru facilities, the Australian government still had the problem of what to do with all the boat people that were turning up. And while it still wanted to maintain heavy border security by turning people back, the closure of the two main processing centres kind of left them, a bit high and dry. So they decided that from now on they were going to store anybody that they managed to capture on Christmas Island. Again, Christmas Island is a very tiny island in the middle of the, just off the border, just out of sea, closer to Indonesia than it is to Australia. But it allowed them to put people somewhere while they sorted out what to do with them. One of the main things was determining whether these people were actual genuine refugees or just economic migrants. The law says that genuine refugees are to be given higher priority than economic migrants, quite simply because the refugees are fleeing persecution, while economic migrants are simply coming to countries in order to take advantage of the kind of culture and the lifestyle and benefit system there. both things are genuine reasons to move to another country or to go to another country. The idea with the refugees, though, is that the long-term goal is to resettle them back in the land of their origin once any kind of trouble there has died down and they're not going to face persecution or torture anymore. The facility on Christmas Island, though, ended up being a bit not too useful. One of the things that happened while I was there was that the Australian government entered into negotiations with the Malaysian government to swap refugees that they had on Christmas Island for some that were being held in Malaysia. Genuine refugees that were being held in Malaysia, while people who had been determined not to be genuine refugees were to be sent from Christmas Island to Malaysia for them to attempt to enter enter Australia the correct way. Again, human rights lawyers and refugee rights lawyers kind of petitioned the government and said, this case needs to be struck down because it's not really fair and stuff like that. So this chugged along until 2012, when finally Christmas Island had become such a debacle that the Australian government announced that they were actually going to reopen both Manus Island, the Manus Island facility, and the Nauru facility. So everything went back to basically how it was before 2008. And but this time, though, when the facility was reopened, the one on Manus Island, the Manus Island one ended up being the primary one. They were going to open two, but the family groups and stuff like that were thought to be best accommodated on Manus Island. The facility was, at the start, was run by Group 4 Security, or G4S, who ran the facility between 2012 and 2014. Then after that, the Australian government entered a contract with a company called Broad Spectrum, who also operated the Nauru facility, to administer the place, and security was provided by a company called Wilson Security. This would have been seen as okay. However, in 2014, an Iranian asylum seeker called Hamid Kazil was there at the Manus Island facility. He attempted to seek medical treatment there for an infected wound, but it couldn't. The wound was so bad it couldn't be treated on the island. The medical staff there tried to evacuate him, to somewhere with better facilities, but the problem was the kind of bureaucracy meant that permission to do this wasn't granted until the 26th of August, which was 2 full days after he'd presented at the hospital. When he got there, he was taken to the Australian mainland and was taken to a hospital in Brisbane. But on the 2nd of September, he was declared dead. His family, he was classed as brain dead. His family gave their permission, and life support was switched off on the 5th of September. And the inquest found, that the messing around and the bureaucracy and stuff had contributed to his death, along with poor medical facilities on the island. So Manus Island got a bit of a bad reputation off the back of that. So things kind of went from bad to worse from that point on. Already the Manus Island facility had a reputation for having, poor facilities. Then had this poor guy die of, what should have been a fairly simple, kind of medical problem. But then on the 26th of April 2016, the Supreme Court of Papua New Guinea held a session and found that the internment camp, the processing centre, or whatever you want to call it, violated the Papua New Guinea constitution, specifically the right to personal liberty, and thus the camp was declared illegal. The Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea said that the facility would be closed. In a statement made on the 27th of April, he said that the centre would be closed and that the government would immediately contact the Australian government to make alternative arrangements for the people there. The Papua New Guinea government said that basically they didn't anticipate that the Manus Island facility would be used for as long as it was. They said that they were under the impression it would only be a temporary solution. they were quite happy to take part in, because they wanted to, to play a role in stopping people, from being killed, or people being, smuggled around the world. However, basically the camp had outstayed its welcome. So the Australians quickly got on to sorting the problem out, and November 2016, they made a deal with the United States that people that were on both Manus and Nauru facilities would be resettled in the United States. This was, seen as an ideal solution. Basically, the camp could be closed down, and the whole matter could be dealt with and sorted. But then, on the 14th of April 2017, which is, this year, we're now up to present day, staff and people that were in the camp, they made the allegation that they had been attacked during the night. People had started shooting at them. And the Chief of Staff for the Papua New Guinea's Defence Force, the military of Papua New Guinea, said that staff from the naval base at Lombrum were investigating the involvement of New Guinean military personnel in the attacks, and said that basically the misuse of weapons was obviously a breach of military discipline, and the police will become involved and prosecute anybody that was found to be connected to it. That investigation, I believe, is still ongoing. I've not been able to find anything else about it. As I said there, the facility came under assault by local people, and nobody was killed, but obviously it's not very nice to be getting shot at by somebody at night. But then, after that, a lawsuit was lodged against against the Australian government, Group for Security and Broad Spectrum, claiming that there was negligence and false imprisonment perpetrated on the facility by all these people. This lawsuit reached a settlement in June 2017 for 70 million plus costs, which came to about 20 million, so about 90 million US dollars. But the Australian government and the other people involved had no admission of liability. They just handed over the money and just said, we refute these claims, but here's some money to compensation for anybody that was unfairly treated or something while I was there. And then the facility was finally closed on the 31st of October 2017, which brings us right up to the point at which the BBC made the news report. Okay, so it's taken us about half an hour or so to get to this point. The background needed explaining before we got onto this. I make no apologies for the half an hour or so of filling in the background story, because quite often people jump into stories like this without actually realising what went off to bring us to that point. But yeah, the BBC have made this report. It's only about 90 seconds long. It just shows footage taken from the inside with some of the people that are still living there, speaking about the conditions they live in. But what's caused this is that on the 31st of October of 2017, a notice was put up inside the Manus Island facility, stating that at 5 p.m. on that day the facility would close, and that the facility itself would be turned over to the Papua New Guinea military, but the Australian government would cease having any responsibility for that particular facility. All water and power would be turned off, and food supplies would be stopped. So basically the facility would be completely closed down. It was set up so that all the people living there would be transferred either to alternate facilities. There were two facilities made available at East Lorengau and West Lorengau. These facilities are more up-to-date, more modern facilities, and considered adequate for the needs of the people living there. However, after the camp was officially closed, 600 of the people that were there, 600 of them, they're all men, refused to leave. And they stated that they were refusing to do so because they didn't feel safe leaving the compound. They go into that a little in the video, but that's basically where we stand at the moment. At the moment there is a disused facility sat empty with no power or water. Food is not being brought there by any official government means. effectively what these 600 men are doing is they are squatting on land and in property that belongs to the Papua New Guinea government. And this is where the BBC's report takes up. So we're going to have a look at that now.
As you see, there is no water, the shower is not working, the hand wash. As you see, this is a very filthy place. Because of the dirtiness, many people got gastro problems that got very ill because of using these toilets.
If there's no rain, normally we used to drink this water. This is the water that we have saved.
Using since the first day we started protest, all these signs we put also here as well. On both sides.
Okay, so having just watched that short piece there of film, it says there, obtained illegally by an Australian NGO. It's quite clear that yes, the conditions inside the facility are filthy and unacceptable. However, I think the idea is that basically that footage was intended to be used to kind of shock people into thinking, oh my god, the Australian government is, being a bunch of assholes to these poor refugees, and not feeding them, not giving them medical facilities, no water and stuff like that. But it doesn't address the fact that these people, these 600 men, have basically inflicted this upon themselves. They are refusing to leave the compound and go to alternative, the alternative accommodations at the other two places that have been set up for them by the Papua New Guinea government, and because they're saying that they fear attack from locals. There have been a couple of things I've noted where it says that people who were originally at the Manus camp, there is a town nearby, and when they have left the camp to visit local shops and stuff, they've come under attack from local people, verbal and physical assaults and stuff like that. But no reason for this is given. For all we know, they could have come under attack because they were stealing from shops, or they were starting trouble. It could just be good old-fashioned racism that's caused these fights. We don't know. There's nothing there that says exactly why these things have happened, or an explanation as to why the alleged attack, when the camp was shot at, happened. But still, when alternate facilities have been made available for them, these guys have absolutely no excuse for not going. These camps are maintained. They are better facilities. There's food, water, medical facilities there, and the facilities will obviously be maintained and kept secure by the authorities that are there to deal with them. As it's been stated, the Australian government now has no responsibility for these people whatsoever. They were instructed to close the camp down and make arrangements. So the Australian government has made arrangements for them, but these people are refusing to basically comply with the stuff that's been done for their benefit. And as it says, the Papua New Guinea military are looking at basically taking back the facility forcibly, because obviously they don't want this place there. They want it demolished and gone. It's this particular camp has outstayed its welcome, and they want to shift everybody to the two new facilities nearby, so that they can be processed and sent on their way to wherever it is they're eventually going to end up. And the cynic in me is basically saying that that these 600 men are up to something. They're doing this for some sort of reason. For example, it showed you the like message board thing with all these heartfelt little messages on it, you know, hashtag Manus Island and why do you exploit our weakness and stuff like that. And something just doesn't add up. I mean, I personally believe, this is just me soapboxing and making an opinion here, but I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, well, you know, we just want to be let into Australia or wherever, you know, no questions asked. We just want in, and this is the problem. This is why I say this is an interesting story that's reflective of the times we live in. This whole thing has come about due to an incident in 2001 where, you know, people from Afghanistan were attempting to seek refuge in Australia. They had a legitimate reason to escape Afghanistan because the particular ethnicity were being persecuted by the you know, the Taliban and the other Muslim groups that were there. They were particularly like they were being oppressed, hunted, persecuted, whatever. But as it's gone into more and more modern times, we're getting more people arriving in Australia or attempting to go to Australia, you know, attempting to migrate not only to Australia but to other countries as well. And with the problems that have been going around with, you know, kind of, you know, Islamic terrorism, it does make sense that before allowing anybody into a country, there should be something done to, you know, sift out who are the real refugees and who are the, you know, the migrants, and of those, who are the ones who are potentially going there to cause trouble. I mean, we've seen what's happened in Germany and Sweden with the, you know, unfiltered, you know, doors open policy that's just allowed anybody to turn up and come in, no questions asked. It's not worked very well, and for this you can sort of applaud the Australian government for having the foresight to do this, try and keep the troublemakers and stuff out. But unfortunately, for some reason, there's a lot of people in the world that think that, you know, it doesn't matter whether people are troublemakers or not. They should just be allowed in, regardless of what their intentions are. Which, you know, I mean, I personally, and I'm not alone. There's quite a lot of people, you know, in the world agree with me. You know, you shouldn't just let randoms in and then just hope that they behave themselves and, you know, hope that they settle down and integrate into the society and, you know, absorb the culture and whatever. But Manus Island, it like I say, it has turned into a bit of a shit show because of this happening, and you know, it's the Australian government are advising the people there to voluntarily go to the new facilities because otherwise the Papua New Guinea military are going to come in and they're going to basically arrest them and treat them as criminals, rather than as people genuinely trying to, you know, seek refuge in another country. So whenever the Papua New Guinea military get round to doing that and arresting people en masse, is you know, it's going to be interesting, because I can bet that there will be a lot of screeching and whinging about human rights and stuff like that. And this is the thing there, you have to understand, well, you have to ask the question, you know, when stuff's being made available to them to go onto and they refuse to go, you know, are they criminals or not? And in this case, yes, they are. They're doing what they're doing for some purpose. So anyways, that's the end of this video. Like I said, this is a little bit different. I'm not really taking the piss or anything. I'm just commenting on and filling in the background for anybody who's heard of this but wasn't really sure what it was about or where it was going. So, well, thank you for watching if you've made it this far. Social contact information and stuff is up on screen. If you're feeling particularly generous, please feel free to donate any amount to me via my PayPal. All donations are received and welcome with thanks. At the moment, it's just I'm trying to, you know, just pay off, you know, living expenses, stuff like that. I've got a few bills that need to be paid and not really enough money to pay them with. So again, thank you for watching, and I will see you next video.